Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we travel to the edge of the Mediterranean, to a city built for ideas and power, where a lighthouse guided ships and a library tried to gather the entire world. This is the story of the Library of Alexandria. We will meet the kings who founded it, the scholars who filled it, and the ambitions that made it more than a building. It was the heart of the motion, a community devoted to study, where thinkers mapped the skies, measured the earth, and organized knowledge itself. We will follow Euclid writing about geometry, Eratosthenes weighing sunlight to find the size of the planet, Callimachus building the first great catalogue, and translators shaping the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures. We will see how scrolls arrived by ship, how languages crossed paths in its halls, and how politics, rivalry, and faith pressed against its walls. And we will ask the questions that still linger. How did it begin? What exactly did it hold? What forces dimmed its light and scattered its books? As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are settling into bed or simply ready to wander through the past, take a breath and let the noise fall away. Let us begin. The story begins on the low spit of land between the Mediterranean and Lake Mareotis, where a Macedonian king drew a rough outline in meal and a flock of birds made off with his plan. In the spring of 331 before the Common Era, Alexander selected the site of a new city on the Egyptian coast and traced its streets with barley flour. The omen was interpreted as prosperity. The sea would feed on the city, and the city would feed the sea. The choice of location was both romantic and ruthlessly practical. To the west lay good anchorages and deep water. To the south stretched a lake that could be joined to the Nile by canals, giving a direct line to the grain fields of the delta and to the river roads of inner Africa. To the east and north stood islands and reefs that could be shaped into breakwaters. A city here could look toward both the Aegean and the Red Sea. It could speak Greek and Egyptian at the same time. Alexander asked Dinocrates of Rhodes, a gifted planner whose name survives only through fragments, to lay out an orthogonal grid, broad avenues, and a royal quarter. The main artery, the Canopic Way, would run east to west for several kilometers, a colonnaded axis wide enough for armies and processions. The ground plan blended the order of classical Greece with the realities of a flat, windswept shore. The harbor would be divided into two basins, a commercial port and a naval station, and a causeway called the Heptastadion would bind the city to the island of Pharos. That causeway, 7 stadia in length by ancient measure, redirected currents and created inner waters so calm that merchants could unload cargo year-round. On Pharos itself, within a few generations, a lighthouse would rise of such height and clarity that sailors took its name for the very idea of a beacon. The master builder was Sostratus of Cnidus. The core was limestone and granite. The top carried a fire whose glow was lifted by polished metal mirrors. Ancient lists called it one of the greatest works of humankind. Alexander did not live to see his city grow. He died in Babylon in 323, before the Common Era, and his generals divided his empire. The body became a prize. Ptolemy, one of the king's most capable companions, seized it on the road and brought it to Egypt. He laid it in a tomb called the Soma. The mausoleum stood in the royal quarter, and for centuries visitors came to view the embalmed conqueror. This act of possession was political stagecraft. With the king's body in Alexandria, Ptolemy claimed the right to stand in the long shadow of his commander. Ptolemy took the royal name and added Soter, the savior. He made Alexandria his capital and set about building more than walls and palaces. He built a state. He secured the delta with garrisons and naval patrols. fortified the frontier to the east at Pelusium, and made peace with those who wished to trade. He kept a careful balance with the priests of Egypt. In temples along the Nile, he is shown in the style of a pharaoh, offering mart and incense to ancient gods. In the streets and courts of Alexandria, he appeared as a Macedonian king. The iconography was not accidental. He ruled Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Phoenicians, Cypriots, and a constant flow of traders from the Levant and the wider Mediterranean. A city of many tongues needed a common civic story and a dependable coin. He minted stable silver and gold, paid his soldiers, rewarded settlers, and kept the grain moving. The Ptolemaic economy rested on the Nile. Each year, the flood turned silt to bread and the delta to a ledger of abundance. Alexandria sat at the mouth of this ledger and became the counting house of the Mediterranean. Granaries rose near the lake. Warehouses lined the harbors. Toll houses recorded the flow of pepper and ivory from the Red Sea, papyrus and glass from Egyptian workshops, timber from the Levant, and wine and oil from the Aegean. Customs revenues enriched the crown. Ships brought people as well. Craftsmen, doctors, scribes, philosophers, and money changers settled in districts that took on the character of their homelands. One quarter, Rakotis, held an older Egyptian village beneath the new grid. Another quarter grew around the Serapeum, where a new composite god would soon embody a policy of cultural fusion. The policy was careful and imaginative. Ptolemy encouraged a cult that blended the bull god Apis and the lord of the underworld Osiris into a figure with Greek philosophical appeal. The name was Serapis. Statues show him bearded and monumental, seated with a basket of grain on his head, a sign of plenty. The cult spoke to farmers and to citizens. It offered a temple hill, the Serapeum, where processions and teachings knitted old Egypt and new Alexandria together. This was not only religion, it was administration by myth. It provided a shared civic calendar, common festivals, and a place where elites could meet under a roof that felt both native and Hellenic. To rule a cosmopolis, the Ptolemies also needed knowledge. They needed accurate surveys of the delta to tax and irrigate, star charts to guide fleets, and doctors to care for armies and citizens. They needed mathematicians to measure and engineers to build. Out of this need grew an ambition that exceeded mere utility. The court began to imagine a house for all learning. An Athenian statesman in exile, Demetrius of Phalerum, found reception in Alexandria and advised Ptolemy on cultural policy. He championed poets, grammarians, and philosophers. He argued that a king who owned the texts of the past could shape the future. The royal quarter soon contained shaded walks, lecture halls, and dining rooms where scholars could eat at public expense. This community came to be known as the Mauseon, the Shrine of the Muses, and beside it or within it rose storerooms that would be called simply the library. Before the shelves were filled, the city needed the tools of a book culture. Papyrus cutters along the Nile harvested reeds, split pith into thin strips, pressed and polished sheets, and sold them by the roll. Scribes learned a rapid hand. Ink makers mixed soot and gum. Carpenters shaped cylindrical boxes for storage. Catalogers designed labels that could be tied to the ends of rolls so that titles were visible even when the scrolls were packed in cubbies. The entire apparatus of written memory began to take physical form. In the harbor, inspectors checked cargoes for books, copied what could be copied, and recorded new arrivals. This was a state enterprise that treated texts like treasures and also like instruments. A grammar of Homer could improve the schooling of bureaucrats. A manual of medicine could keep the garrison alive through a summer fever. A treatise on geometry could train surveyors who would place canals with more precision and save grain. The view from the water told the story to every new arrival. The lighthouse on Pharos signaled approach long before the shore was visible. The twin basins of the harbor spread out behind breakwaters. The heptastadion lay like a spear across the sea, with waves brushing its northern face and fishing boats tucked safe to the south. The Canopic Way gleamed in the heat, a straight line that drew the eye into the royal quarter. There, the Soma held the dead king. Nearby, the palaces of Ptolemy shimmered behind gardens and pools. Statuary-lined courtyards. A visitor could turn inland and see the Serapeum on its hill, with stairs climbing to a precinct shaded by colonnades. The city looked young and confident, but its confidence came from deliberate design. It was a machine built to collect and amplify power, goods, and knowledge. By the time Ptolemy passed the throne to his son, Philadelphus, Alexandria had become more than a naval station and more than a market. It had become an argument about what a city could be. It gathered peoples and languages. It joined the Nile to the sea. It built a lighthouse to make the unknown less dangerous. It fostered a temple that spoke two religious grammars at once. And in quiet rooms near the royal quarter, it began to gather the words of the world. The ambition of the dynasty was not simply to rule a territory. It was to claim the memory of civilization itself and to place it within reach of a single city. In the cool courtyards of the royal quarter, where fig trees threw a dappled shade and the air held the salt of the two harbors, the Ptolemies set out to build a sanctuary not of stone alone, but of memory. The name they chose was ancient and disarming, Maushon, the place of the muses, a shrine for every art of the mind. Within its precincts would stand lecture halls, refectories, covered walks, gardens watered by channels from Lake Mariotis, a small menagerie for the study of animals, and rooms for star watching when the desert air went glass clear. It would be a community more than a building. Citizens of the mind would live there at public expense and devote their days to the acts that turn curiosity into knowledge. The idea had a midwife. Demetrius of Phalerum had governed Athens and then fallen from favor. He fled to Egypt and found in Ptolemy a ruler who understood that culture is a form of power. Demetrius advised the king to gather scholars as other kings gathered mercenaries. The veteran of Alexander's campaigns recognized the usefulness at once. To govern Egypt, he needed surveyors who could divide fields with exactness after the Nile receded. He needed doctors for garrisons, astronomers for navigation, grammarians to codify language for administration, and philosophers to teach the next generation of officials to reason about law and justice. He also understood theater, a court that could summon the wisdom of the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the wider world would display a legitimacy beyond the sword. Ptolemy began the work, and his son Philadelphus made it his favorite child. Stipends were assigned that covered housing, food, and the tools of study. Scholars were freed from taxes and civic burdens. The crown paid for scribes and copyists. There were stewards for the kitchens, gardeners who kept vines and shade trees, and attendants who set water clocks to mark debates and lectures. The rules of the Mausion read like the charter of a small city. Residents dined together. They taught, debated, compiled, and wrote. The head of the community held a priestly title, a reminder that learning was being placed under the protection of the gods. Alongside this living academy grew the instrument that would make Alexandria a legend. The library began as storerooms in the royal quarter, and as a practice, almost a habit, of seeking out every written work that could be obtained. Procurators of books were sent to the islands and to mainland markets with sealed letters and heavy purses. They bought the collections of private men who preferred money to posterity. They sought the oldest copies they could find, trusting age over fashion. Ships arriving in the harbors were inspected. Scrolls found on board were taken to official scribes who copied them in a practiced hand. The originals remained in Alexandria, and the ship owner received clean copies on papyrus, so smooth it gleamed. It was acquisition by law and by appetite. For the mechanism to work, a whole economy of writing had to be nourished. Papyrus cutters along the marshes of the Nile Delta harvested and sliced the pith of reeds into ribbons, laid them crosswise in 2 layers, pressed them under weights, and polished the sheets with ivory. The finest grade was reserved for royal work and bore a sheen that took crisp ink without feathering. Ink makers mixed soot with gum, arabic, and water, and sometimes added wine or vinegar to alter flow and color. Quills could not be cut from the birds of Egypt without waste, so scribes favored reed pens that could be sharpened again and again. Rulers and compasses for diagrams sat beside lamps that burned oil made from local olives. The rooms where copyists labored were kept as free of dust as Alexandria would allow. The new abundance of texts created a problem that is still the sign of a healthy library. Finding anything became hard. The answer at Alexandria was an invention in its own right. Callimachus of Cyrene began a project known as the Pinakes, meaning tables or tablets. It was a vast catalogue that organized the holdings by author, by literary form, and by subject. It recorded first lines, short biographies of authors, and comments on authenticity. It created a map of knowledge that a reader could hold in the mind. The Pinakes were themselves a kind of literature, a narrative of what human beings had written and what that writing meant. With them, a scholar seeking the lost plays of Aeschylus or the fragments of Heraclitus could be guided at speed through the maze. The librarians who presided over this enterprise became figures of state. Zenodotus of Ephesus is often named as the first to hold the office. He produced corrected texts of Homer from the many divergent copies in circulation, collating verses with a patience that would have defeated most men. He marked suspect lines and variants and gave future readers the first critical edition of the poems that shaped Greek education. Eratosthenes of Cyrene would later take the post and bring a mathematician's sense of order to geography and chronology. Aristophanes of Byzantium and Aristarchus of Samothrace refined textual criticism until the word Alexandrian came to mean a scholar who could tell an interpolation from an authentic verse at a glance. Under Philadelphus, the library took on great translation projects that fit both curiosity and politics. The most famous is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that came to be called the Septuagint. The story of 70 or more learned men translating in harmony is part legend and part instruction, but the result was decisive. Jewish communities in Alexandria and throughout the Greek-speaking world gained a portable text that could be read in synagogues and studied in schools. The project affirmed a truth the Ptolemies wanted the city to embody. Alexandria could be a meeting place where traditions were preserved by being made intelligible to others. The crown acquired manuscripts with a zeal that bordered on predation. A celebrated episode tells how Ptolemy obtained the official Athenian copies of the tragedians by depositing a vast sum as security. He kept the originals and wrote off the deposit as the price of having the most authoritative texts in the world. Agents pursued the private heirs of Aristotle's library, which had passed to Nellius of Skepsis, and then disappeared into storage to avoid confiscation. Booksellers learned to look south to Egypt when a noble family died and a study was to be sold. Rival cities noticed. Pergamum built a library of its own that could stand beside Alexandria, and stories later claimed that parchment rose to prominence there when papyrus supplies grew uncertain. Legends flourish where competition is real. Alexandria also created a second site for books beyond the royal quarter. In the district that climbed toward the southwest, stood the Serapeum, the temple of the god who fused Egyptian and Greek sensibilities. It held classrooms and statues, and a library that came to be known as a daughter to the greater store. There, students encountered philosophy among columns and courtyards that smelled of incense. The presence of a library within a temple made a quiet statement. Sacred knowledge and secular knowledge were not seen as enemies. Both were forms of learning that gave a city coherence. The daily life of the Mausian was as practical as it was grand. A new arrival might spend the first weeks mastering the hand used in the copy rooms and learning the conventions of citation that allowed readers to trace a claim to its source. Mornings brought lectures in grammar and logic. Afternoons belonged to research, or to the slow labor of copying and collation. Meals were taken at common tables, which mattered more than it seems. Conversation at dinner could turn a hunch into a project, or a rumor into a line of inquiry. Visitors from Rhodes or Syracuse or Cyrene carried news of methods and discoveries. When a patron entered the refectory, the scholars rose. The Ptolemies did not let the community forget who paid for the candles that lit their pages after sunset. To see the library at work is to understand that the Ptolemies were governing the future. In a climate where papyrus decays and insects do as they have always done, the only way to preserve words is to multiply them. The copyists of Alexandria multiplied texts on a scale that none had attempted before. As a result, when later fires and wars came, there were other copies in other cities. The ambition to hold everything in one place was impossible even then. The practice of sending sponsored copies to allies and to friendly schools created a network of texts that spread across the Mediterranean world. The idea of a universal library turned out to be a way to seed the world with duplicates. Numbers from antiquity are often hopeful, but even cautious historians accept that the collection reached into the hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The figures matter less than the pattern. With each set of purchases, with each inspection of cargoes, with each private collection acquired, the shelves became a survey of human thought from Egypt and Greece and beyond. There were works from Ionia on natural philosophy, treatises from Sicily on mathematics, plays and histories from mainland Greece, and travel accounts from men who had followed caravans across Syria and ships down the Red Sea. Alexandria did not only copy, it compared, corrected, commented, and catalogued. It made texts more accurate and more findable. It made knowledge usable. In that act lay the deepest reason why the Mausian and its library mattered. The Ptolemies had taken a sandbank and a fishing village and turned it into a city that could train navigators, doctors, engineers, poets, and administrators for an empire built on a river and a sea. They had created a stage on which every subject could be argued and improved. The Muses were not sentimental patrons. They were the names of disciplines. To bring them into one house was to claim that a state could be strong because it was learned. At its height, the Mausian was not a quiet library, but a living machine for ideas. The porters who hauled baskets of papyrus up from the docks worked in the same organism as the mathematician tracing a proof in a colonnade, and the physician sharpening a bronze scalpel for a difficult lesson in anatomy. The institution worked because the Ptolemaic state treated knowledge as a craft that required tools, time, and community, and because a remarkable procession of minds chose to live under its roof. Mathematics set the tempo. Euclid taught in Alexandria in the reign of Ptolemy I, and perhaps into the reign of his son. His Elements was already a classic in his lifetime, a carefully graded ladder from definitions and axioms to theorems that could withstand any honest test. The work did not invent geometry, it domesticated it. Students trained on Euclid learned to think in steps, to state what was given, to show what must follow, and to accept that rigor is a form of economy. In the same generation came Apollonius of Perga, who wrote his conics in Alexandria and left the world a vocabulary that engineers still speak without noticing. Ellipse, parabola, hyperbola. These were not decorations, they were the natural shapes of orbits and trajectories and mirrors. In a city that guided fleets by the light of the pharaohs, the science of reflection and focus was a practical art. Eratosthenes of Cyrene represents the Alexandrian ideal at full power. Librarian, geographer, chronologer, and poet, he calculated the size of the earth with a method that is still taught for its clean audacity. He knew that at Syene, near today's Aswan, the midday sun at the summer solstice shone to the bottom of a deep well and cast no shadow on a vertical stick. At the same moment in Alexandria, a gnomon did throw a shadow. He measured the angle, a little more than 7 degrees, which is close to 1/50th of a circle. He multiplied the measured distance between the two cities by 50 and arrived at a circumference in the neighborhood of 250,000 stadia. The length of the stadium varied by place, but even conservative conversions put his answer within a few percent of modern measurement. He also drew a world map with parallels and meridians as guiding lines, and produced a sieve method for identifying prime numbers that still bears his name. Astronomy reached through Alexandria, though not all of it was born there. Aristarchus of Samos argued that the Earth moves around the Sun and that the stars are very far away. The proposal did not carry the day in his century, but the fact that such a view could be developed and debated shows the intellectual weather of the city. Conon of Samos worked in Alexandria and exchanged problems with Archimedes of Syracuse. Their friendship produced the Archimedean spiral and a calendar of eclipses important for astronomy and for the sacred year. Hipparchus later worked mostly on roads, but he mined observations that Alexandrian observers had preserved and compared them with Babylonian records. Out of that comparison came the great discovery of the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble of the Earth that only patient, multi-generational datasets can reveal. Natural philosophy in Alexandria was embodied in machines as well as manuscripts. Ctesibius, the son of a barber, made devices that turned air and water into obedient servants. He improved the water clock with a regulating float and designed piston pumps that could raise water against head pressure. He wrote a treatise on pneumatics that inspired generations of tinkerers. A century later, Hero of Alexandria gathered the mechanical arts into handbooks that described temple doors that opened by themselves when a fire was lit on an altar, theatrical automata driven by falling weights, and a steam-powered sphere that spun on its pivots. These were amusements and proofs of concept, but they also trained craftsmen to think in terms of valves, seals, siphons, and feedback. Medicine was bolder in Alexandria than in any Greek city that came before it. Herophilus of Chalcedon and Erasistratus of Chios dissected human cadavers. Some ancient sources claim they performed vivisection on condemned criminals, a claim modern scholars discuss with caution. But no one doubts that they opened bodies and described what they saw. Herophilus distinguished sensory nerves from motor nerves and traced many of them to the spinal cord. He named the duodenum, described the ventricles of the brain, and wrote on the pulse with a precision that allowed diagnosis by rhythm and strength. Erasistratus described the valves of the heart and argued that it worked as a pump rather than as a hearth of innate heat. He spoke of the brain as the seat of mind. The medical school that formed around their work combined anatomical observation with a sharp interest in dietetics and environment. In the delta where fevers rose with the flood, that was life-saving knowledge. Language itself became an Alexandrian craft. Zenodotus, Aristophanes of Byzantium, and Aristarchus of Samothrace confronted a library full of variant texts and taught the world how to edit. They developed a suite of critical signs. The obelos marked a suspect verse, The asterisk signaled a duplicate. The dipli drew attention to an important reading. They compared dozens of Homeric copies, removed lines believed to be later additions, and set the two poems in a form that would be copied for 2 millennia. They wrote learned introductions that gave the lives of poets, listed their works, and explained dialect and myth. Dionysius Thrax, a student in this tradition, wrote the first surviving manual of Greek grammar. It divided language into parts of speech and gave schoolmasters a tool that could be used from Spain to the Indus Valley, wherever Greek was studied. History and ethnography were not neglected. Manetho, an Egyptian priest writing in Greek, organized the long river of Egyptian kings into dynasties and synchronized reigns with lunar and solar cycles. His lists, though not perfect, gave later historians a skeleton key to the temples. Timosthenes, an admiral and geographer, wrote on winds and sailing directions and produced a coastal guide that pilots could trust. The Mausian welcomed scholars who collected proverbs, catalogued the victors of the games, and compiled chronologies of theaters and festivals. The habit of list-making was not trivial. In a world without printing, a list was a navigational chart through an ocean of handwritten rolls. Literature flourished in the shadow of scholarship. Callimachus wrote epigrams that glittered with learning and argued that a long poem is not necessarily a great one. Theocritus shaped the pastoral genre with scenes that only a city could imagine. Apollonius of Rhodes wrote the Argonautica in a style that fused epic with learned reference and courtly expectation. These were poets who dined with librarians and argued with them. The interplay of creation and criticism gave the city a distinct voice. Even its quarrels became part of the legacy, as when Callimachus and Apollonius exchanged needling lines about what sort of poetry deserved a crown. Translation work at Alexandria widened the audience of entire civilizations. The Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures that came to be called the Septuagint was a landmark in the creation of a Mediterranean public. It allowed congregations throughout the Greek-speaking world to read sacred history in the language of commerce and philosophy. It gave Greek readers access to Hebrew poetry and law, and it supplied future Christian writers with a vocabulary that would shape theology and art. Other translation projects moved in different directions. Egyptian medical and ritual texts entered Greek compilations. Treatises on arithmetic and astronomy that had roots in Mesopotamia were edited, commented upon, and sent back into circulation with names of Alexandrian scholars on their covers. The administration that underwrote this work thought about more than prestige. The crown needed accurate calendars to time tax collection and cult, accurate star tables to steer convoys, and trained clerks who could keep accounts in an empire of grain. The Mausian returned that investment with a steady flow of applied knowledge. Surveyors trained in Euclidean method placed new canals and measured out fields after the flood. Shipwrights learned to loft hulls with curves that Ctesibius and Archimedes would have recognized. Physicians who had read Herophilus reduced the mortality of soldiers and dockworkers. The lighthouse was not the only instrument that kept the city alive. Famous visitors amplified the reputation of the place. Archimedes spent time in Alexandria and maintained a long correspondence with friends there. His treatise on floating bodies, his measurement of a circle, and his playful problems on cattle and combinatorics moved up and down the Nile and across the Aegean as packets of papyrus. Strabo came later and found the Mausian still a place for study, even as royal support began to thin. Travelers carried away the idea that a state could centralize curiosity and that such centralization could pay. The librarians and their colleagues also invented professional habits that endure. They cited sources, they dated events by multiple chronologies, and told readers how they reconciled them. They kept working bibliographies and revised them when better copies arrived. They recorded the first lines of rolls, so that a text could be identified even if a title had been lost. They taught students to distrust smooth stories and to ask how a manuscript had reached the table. In other words, they made criticism into a civic virtue. It is easy to sentimentalize a great library. The Alexandrians themselves were not sentimental. They were practical and proud. They liked order, and they liked to argue. They believed that words could be improved, and that numbers could tell the truth about a world that many preferred to explain by myth alone. Their city gave them a stage on which to demonstrate that belief. What they built in those generations was more than a collection. It was a method, a set of expectations about evidence and proof that would continue to work even when buildings fell and scrolls turned back to dust. Morning in Alexandria began with the rattle of carts on the Canopic Way and the slow swing of the harbor cranes over basins that mirrored the pale Sunday. In the royal quarter, the marble stayed cool a little longer, shaded by porticos and fig trees and the tall plains that loved the damp air from Lake Mariotis. Within that ordered calm, the Mausian woke like a monastery of inquiry. Servants trimmed the wicks of oil lamps in the copy rooms and refilled inkwells with a careful hand. A steward checked the water clock that governed lectures and colloquia. The bell of bronze he struck gave a round note that carried through cloisters and gardens. Scholars in linen mantles came out of their lodgings and gathered for bread and olives and the first talk of the day. The conversations were practical. What roles were expected from the customs house, whose reading of a corrupt line in Aeschylus now seemed persuasive, which seedling in the botanic garden appeared to have taken to the brackish soil. News moved with the bread. The Mausian was a living compound rather than a single hall of books. Walkways connected dining rooms to lecture courts, copyist chambers to an observatory with a flat roof where lines were inscribed for measuring the passage of stars. There were gardens kept not for ornament alone but for study. Physicians grew simples for their demonstrations. Natural philosophers set out basins where they could observe the breeding of eels when the Nile flood came. An enclosure held gazelles and ibises, and a few imported monkeys. A small menagerie that allowed comparison of bone and muscle between species. A path led uphill toward the Serapeum, where the daughter library kept a second hive of study, and the precinct offered lofty views over roofs and harbor. The work began with the arrival of texts. Royal policy made the librarians partners of the harbor officials. When a ship reached the quay, its cargo was inspected not only for copper ingots and amphorae of wine, but also for rolls that might be new to the city. The law was blunt and the practice elaborate. Any book on board was recorded by a clerk, taken to the copy rooms, and returned as a fair duplicate on clean papyrus. The original remained in Alexandria. Owners grumbled and then accepted the exchange when they saw the quality of the copy. The city paid for the labor from a royal fund that also covered stipends, repairs, and the upkeep of the catalogue. In this way, the Mausian turned the traffic of a world port into an engine for scholarship. Inside the copy rooms, the air smelled faintly of resin and lamp oil. Tables were set at a height that spared the back. The papyrus sheets were cut and joined edge to edge with paste to make long bands that would be rolled around wooden cores. Each sheet had a horizontal grain and a vertical grain where the pith strips crossed, and scribes preferred to write along the smoother direction. A trained reader spoke the text in a measured voice while 2 or 3 hands wrote together, each on his own roll. The lector paused at points where a word might be ambiguous and consulted another exemplar if one existed in the collection. Short marks above lines noted accents and breathings, the Alexandrian habit of helping the eye where the ear might mislead. At the end of a roll, the scribe wrote a subscription that gave the title, the author, and often the number of lines, a count that helped catch omissions in later copies. The roll was then dusted with a little chalk to keep the ink from smearing, tied with a linen cord, and fitted with a label that hung from the outer edge where a reader could see it in the pigeonhole of a shelf. Order was the second labor of every day. The Pinakes of Callimachus guided the shelving and the borrowing. Assistants trained to read the catalogue learned its structure as they might learn a city map. Poetry, drama, history, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, geography, and the rest. Within each class, the catalogue listed authors, works, first lines for identification, and short lives that explained provenance and fame. A scholar who sought a particular book would present his request to the desk of the bibliophylax, the guardian of the rolls, who would send runners along the colonnades to fetch the items. If a scholar asked instead for a subject, the guardian consulted the Pinakes and made a selection from the shelves, often adding a commentary or a rival version so that comparison could begin at once. The system turned a maze into a street plan. Meals were taken at common tables, which were offices by other means. A physician might eat with a grammarian and an astronomer and find that conversation solved a nervous problem of his own. A doctor who needed a more precise description of a bone might learn the shape words from a man who edited Homer. An astronomer who wondered whether vapor rising from marshes could bend light at the horizon might ask a physician what fevers did to the eye. The head of the Moussion presided with the easy authority of a priest. He kept the peace in disputes and decided when a project had claim to resources from the treasury. The din of talk was constant but not rude. Respect was shown in habits rather than in silence. When a royal patron entered, the scholars stood. When a visiting savant from Rhodes or Antioch took lunch, a chair of honor was offered, and a student read a short encomium for the guest. Instruction filled the late morning. In the grammar court, a master took up a roll of Homer and showed how a poem could be read as if it were a living animal that must be dissected with care. He pointed to a line where an epithet differed between copies, explained the dialect of the form, and gave reasons for preferring one reading over another. In another court, a geometer used a rope and pegs to mark out a proof on sand, then redrew it on board with charcoal. A physician brought out a model of the human heart carved from wax and wood and explained the direction of flow, while a boy turned a small piston pump to mimic the pulse. A philosopher gathered a circle under an arbor and took his students through a dialogue of Plato, then asked whether the argument held when tested against the practice of courts in Alexandria. The sessions differed in method, but shared a belief that knowledge must be examined in public. Afternoons belonged to quiet labor. Scholars sat with rolls on stands and narrow knives at hand to lift a fiber and examine a layer. The scriptio continua of the writing required a trained eye and a memory for a language that rarely marked the boundaries of words. The editor made faint dots or small hooks where divisions made sense and left the rest to be argued in the margin. Where two exemplars disagreed, he recorded both readings and wrote a brief note to say which seemed more ancient and why. Aristarchus kept a set of signs for this work. A small obelos noted a line that smelled of a later hand. A dipple in the margin called a reader to attention. These marks were not ornaments. They were the beginnings of an ethics of citation that would endure in many alphabets. The Mausian had its rituals and also its quarrels. The poets argued about the value of short forms versus long forms. The mathematicians argued about method, about diagrams drawn to scale, about whether a proof must be purely deductive or could admit argument from measure. Physicians took sides between those who put their faith in anatomy and those who trusted humoral balance described by the ancients. The disputes were not personal when the rules of the community held. They could become violent in the city at large when politics intruded. Within the walls of the Mausian, the rules protected debate. The head of the community could suspend a stipend for a time if a scholar broke decorum. The king could, on rare occasions, banish a man whose words turned seditious. Most often, the gravity of shared work kept tempers in their courses. The Serapeum gave the life of study another form. Its steps rose high above the streets, and the precinct within had its own order. Priests tended the cult of Serapis with incense and music. In adjoining halls, students read Aristotle and Zeno and learn to argue before they learn to govern. The daughter library kept rolls in cedar-lined cases that discouraged pests. In the hot months, the great doors were opened in the morning and closed at noon to save the cool. In the evening, the halls filled again with readers who used the last light for an hour before lamps were lit. The combination of temple and library created an atmosphere that was both sacred and practical. The smell of cedar and oil and papyrus made a perfume that visitors remembered for the rest of their lives. Daily life included an unglamorous attention to preservation. Insects loved glue and starch. Mold loved the breath of the sea. Librarians rotated rolls so that none sat too long in a damp corner. Cedar oil was brushed on shelves as a deterrent. Rolls were inspected for frayed edges and retipped where necessary with fresh papyrus. The average roll might contain 20 sheets and stretch to a length that required 2 hands to handle with ease. Longer works were divided into books and numbered so that a reader knew which part he held. When a roll had served many readers, a copy was ordered if the text was valuable. If better copies arrived, inferior ones were retired to storerooms along the back corridors. Nothing was discarded without record. The catalogue noted the change and the reasons for it. Evenings returned to community. Public recitals drew citizens into the precinct. A poet would sing a new idyll and then answer questions about a line that alluded to a Theban festival. A historian would read a page from his account of a voyage to Cyrene and hold up a small map drawn in colored inks. A physician who had visited the Delta during the flood described patterns of disease he had seen and suggested a schedule for future clinics. The Mautian was not a cloister cut off from Alexandria. It was the beating mind of the city speaking to the streets that fed it. The presence of the crown could be felt without the noise of politics. The priest of the Mautian kept a list of residents for the palace steward who managed stipends. The steward delivered coin or grain at fixed intervals. Larger grants were made for special projects. When the head of the library undertook a new edition of Homer, the palace funded the purchase of additional exemplars. When the astronomers needed bronze for a new armillary sphere, the metal came from the royal store. When the physicians proposed an anatomical theatre built to keep cadavers cooled and screened, masons appeared with plans and a foreman. The Ptolemies were not democrats. They were patrons. They expected gratitude in forms they could display to visitors. They received dedications written in the front of books and demonstrations of machines that worked on command. The city beyond the walls influenced the curriculum. Alexandria was the counting house of the Mediterranean. The need for reliable measures and honest accounts shaped the way arithmetic was taught. It was taught with counters and boards and with problems taken from the docks and the market. A student learned to compute volumes of grain in a warehouse that had irregular walls. He learned to estimate losses in transit and to evaluate a claim by a ship owner who blamed a storm for slippage in cargo. He learned to check the minting of coin by weighing samples and measuring the consistency of alloy. The Mauseon turned mathematics into a civic instrument. Foreign voices gave the place a cosmopolitan tone that no single city could have supplied. Jewish scholars worked on translation in a room that smelled of papyrus and cedar and read their Greek aloud to be sure that poetry survived the crossing from one language to another. Egyptian priests passed through with scrolls that held rituals and calendars and hymns, texts that were copied for the collection with the care given to Greek drama. Merchants from Syria and sailors from Cyprus brought stories of distant harbors, lists of winds and currents, and the occasional travel account written by a literate captain who had the habit of keeping a journal. All of this material flowed into the hands of editors and catalogers. The library became not only a storehouse of Greek letters, but a prism that refracted many traditions into a comprehensible whole. Within this rhythm of work and talk, there were moments of theatre. A new acquisition might cause a crowd in the refectory. The royal procurator had purchased the private rolls of a celebrated philosopher, and they arrived tied in bundles with wax seals. The head librarian broke a seal and read the first lines. There was a hush, and then a buzz of comment as names and titles were recognized. The copyists were told to clear tables. The catalogers brought out their tablets. The day's plan was altered by the arrival of a treasure, and the community shifted to receive it as a school of fish turns when a shadow moves across the sea. There were also quiet scenes that reveal the character of the place. A young scholar returned a roll of Thucydides and apologized for a smear he had made when his lamp guttered. The guardian waved the apology away and showed him how to place a small glass bowl behind the wick to catch soot and reduce smoke. A physician revising a treatise thanked a grammarian for finding a better word for a swelling that rises behind the knee. The grammarian asked the physician to explain the difference between a tendon and a ligament and took notes for a lexicon he intended to write. Small courtesies passed back and forth and accumulated into an atmosphere of mutual help. The calendar of the Mausian followed both gods and seasons. Festivals brought pauses in work and gave the community occasions to present itself to the city. On the day devoted to the Muses, there were processions with garlands, recitations of hymns, and a public display of devices from the mechanical rooms. Children were allowed to tug on cords that opened temple doors with hidden counterweights. Sailors laughed at a small figure that turned, lifted a cup, and poured wine when heat from a lamp moved air through a chamber. In the hot months, work began early and ended early. In the cool months, the evenings were long, and the reading rooms glowed with light until late. The Mausian educated more than scholars. Boys who would become clerks in the treasury learned to read accounts with rigor and to write a hand that would be legible 50 years later. Surveyors learned to measure and to make plans that other men could follow. Shipwrights learned to read tables of curvature and to translate a set of numbers into a hull that would hold the sea. Physicians trained apprentices by naming bones on models and by teaching them to listen to a pulse and to count beats against the drip of a water clock. The city drew competence from the precincts as readily as it drew learning. Women appear rarely in the daily record of the Mausion, which reflects the customs of the time rather than the capacity of minds. There were learned women in Alexandria, particularly in later centuries when philosophy circles gathered around teachers like Hypatia. In the early period, the precincts were largely inhabited by men who wrote and taught and kept the rhythms of the community. The absence should be remembered as part of the culture that built wonders while limiting who could build them. From time to time, the library received gifts that were meant to impress as well as to nourish scholarship. A king in Asia sent a celestial globe with inscriptions in a language few could read. A wealthy Alexandrian merchant sent a cabinet of ivory with drawers that fit together so precisely that a change in humidity would keep it from opening. The drawers were soon filled with small rolls that contained glossaries and lists and fragments that did not justify an entire pigeonhole. The ivory smiled in the light and served a purpose that the donor perhaps never imagined. The librarians were grateful and wrote a polite note that praised both the beauty and the utility of the object. Above all, life in the great library was a discipline of attention. The scholars of Alexandria lived in the presence of many voices. They listened, compared, weighed, and wrote. They built tools of order, from catalogue lists to editorial signs, that later generations would take for granted. They made a practice of public testing that we recognize as the skeleton of research. They ate at common tables because knowledge grows with conversation. They relied on royal money and knew the price of that reliance. They placed their tables near windows because the light from the sea is a teacher of its own. They believed that a city could become strong by becoming learned, and that a library could be the heart of such a city. In the late hours, when the harbor lamps flickered across still water and the lighthouse beam licked the haze, a reader might sit with a roll of Herodotus or a notebook of his own and listen to the faint grind of a water clock. He would mark a line, consider a variant, and then look up at the dark where the wind shifted and brought the smell of salt and pitch. Somewhere beyond the breakwater, a ship rolled gently, and a sailor told a story that would reach a copyist's table by the end of the season. The city breathed through the rooms of the Mausoleum, and the library breathed back into the city. It was a rhythm that felt as natural as tide and as deliberate as law. It made Alexandria what it claimed to be, a place where the world could be read. The flowering of the Mausoleum did not end with a single blow. It thinned under the pressure of court politics, regional wars, economic shocks along the Nile, and a dynasty that had begun to devour its own talent. By the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Ptolemaic court was a theater where family quarrels became state policy and where scholars discovered that a stipend could vanish with a rumor. The political arc began earlier with a period of prosperity. Ptolemy III, called the Benefactor, had projected confidence with public works and with the famous Canopus decree that celebrated plenty and piety. His successors inherited a city that still glittered and a countryside that continued to feed the Mediterranean. Yet royal authority was already fraying. The long reign of Ptolemy VI, called Philometor, was marked by civil war with his brother Ptolemy VIII, called Physcon by satirists for his heavy body and heavier hand. The brothers alternated power in Alexandria and in the older capital at Memphis. Sister queens named Cleopatra shifted alliances in a pattern that confused even contemporaries. The dynasty that had once set its face calmly toward the sea now stared into mirrors. In this turbulence, the library and the Mausoleum were more vulnerable than their marble courts suggested. Scholars relied on royal favor, and the man who controlled the priestly office that supervised the Mausoleum could make or unmake a career. When Ptolemy VIII secured Alexandria after years of rivalry, he moved quickly against those he feared. He blamed the city elite, and especially its intellectual class, for siding with his rivals. Ancient writers describe a purge that cut through the lecture halls. The head librarian Aristarchus of Samothrace, the most exacting critic of Homer that the ancient world produced, resigned and fled. He died soon after in exile on Cyprus. Other scholars took ship for Rhodes, for Pergamum, for Antioch, and for the islands where small courts still paid for learning because prestige mattered. The Exodus changed the map of Mediterranean scholarship. Students who had come to Alexandria to learn the craft of editing and commentary found the doors shut. They followed their masters to safer harbors. Dionysius Thrax wrote the first systematic grammar that survives, a short book that shaped language teaching for 2 millennia. He taught in Rhodes rather than on the Canopic Way. Pergamum strengthened its own circle of poets and librarians and set its own standards for cataloging and conservation. The library there already had a claim to excellence, and the departure from Alexandria made that claim stronger. Even the story that Pergamum favored parchment when papyrus grew scarce reads like a parable of this moment, a reminder that technologies and methods move with people when courts behave like weather. Alexandria paid a price beyond reputation. The purge delivered what the court needed in the short term, which was quiet, but it removed the questioning minds that had made the city famous for rigor. The character of scholarship inside the Mausoleum shifted. The Great Age of Discovery became an age of commentary. The word Alexandrian, once a proud name for exact work, began to gather a second meaning. It came to describe a way of reading that cut and classified but did not risk bold, new syntheses. Some of this judgment is unfair. Commentaries preserve knowledge. They also create the tools that later generations use to understand the past. Yet the perception of a cooling center was real enough that travelers noticed it and wrote it down. Court politics continued to spill into the streets. Ptolemy VIII married his sister Cleopatra II and then married her daughter Cleopatra III. Faction followed faction. Riots broke out in the city. Ancient reports speak of killings ordered at a banquet and of reprisals that filled the harbor with mourning. In the countryside, the 2nd century saw a string of uprisings in Upper Egypt, where a rival king at Thebes claimed authority and minted coin. Tax revenues wobbled. When the Nile floods failed or simply disappointed, the city felt the hunger in the price of bread. A state that must choose between paying soldiers and paying scholars will pick soldiers. Stipends were not always cut on paper. They were simply paid late, or paid in grain of poor quality, or paid not at all. Amid this, royal decrees tried to stitch society back together. The Great Amnesty Decree of 118 before the Common Era offered pardons to many who had taken the wrong side in the years of civil conflict and tried to regularize property titles and tax obligations. Priests, soldiers, and householders were named, and categories carefully defined. The aim was to restore the predictability that had once made Ptolemaic rule feel like a bargain. A calmer city might welcome back its scholars. A normal harvest might refill the treasuries that fed the Mausian. External pressure compounded internal strain. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV had invaded Egypt earlier and had been forced to withdraw when a Roman envoy drew a circle in the sand at Eleusis and demanded a decision before the king stepped out of it. The story is famous because it captures a turning point. Rome had appeared as a polite solicitor in earlier decades. By the mid-2nd century, it spoke with the voice of a power that expected obedience. Alexandria could not ignore the new geometry of the Mediterranean. Roman patrons and Roman creditors began to appear in the city with requests that were really orders. The court learned that a letter from the Senate could carry more weight than a promise from a temple. The Mausians still had moments of brilliance even in this season of contraction. Didymus, the scholar later nicknamed Bronze Guts for his endless productivity, belonged to the next century, but already the habit of exhaustive annotation had taken root. The physicians continued to teach. The mathematicians continued to refine proofs. The astronomers continued to compare observations across generations to save phenomena that might otherwise vanish into myth. But the pride of place that had once drawn the brightest minds without effort was gone. Recommendations that once sent a young scholar south with certainty now carried a caution. "Go if you can," said the letters, "but keep your papers in a waterproof chest." The spaces of learning within the city adapted. The Serapeum, already a daughter library and a school within a temple, became more conspicuous as a place where philosophy and mathematics could be pursued with a degree of insulation from the palace. Its priests were skilled at managing relationships with the court and with the foreign communities that made Alexandria cosmopolitan. Students who found the royal quarter too tense could climb the hill and read under cedar beams that smelled of oil and incense. The cohabitation of cult and study seemed to shelter thought from the gusts of the harbor. In this period, the administration of the library itself revealed the tone of the age. The post of head librarian, once the capstone of a life in scholarship, could be given to a courtier with little learning but much loyalty. A name in a list that ought to have belonged to a philologist sometimes belonged to a palace official. The change was not constant, and now and then a true scholar held the keys and guided the catalogue. Yet the pattern was clear enough to those who watched appointments. The city that had invented professional standards for textual work now compromised those standards in its own institutions. Students learned a second lesson that is as old as cities. Excellence needs not only talent and training, it needs protection from fashion and from fear. The decline of royal patronage also affected the fragile ecology of preservation. Copying slows when stipends shrink. Inspection of shelves becomes less frequent when stewards leave to take better-paid work in a counting house. Cedar oil is expensive when olive harvests are poor, and insects cannot read budgets. The librarians did what they had always done. They triaged. They commissioned fresh copies of authors that everybody agreed must be saved, and they allowed lesser works to wait another year. The Pinaques continued to give order, but the lived map of the collection grew spotty as some cupboards filled while others emptied. The wider city mirrored the library. Great houses in the Greek quarter still held dinner parties where poets read a new idyll, and where an inventor turned a crank to make a small bird sing. Workshops on the edge of Rakotis still mended nets and hammered copper into bowls. At the harbour, the heptastadion still carried carts and foot traffic across its long spine. But there was an undertone of calculation in the way merchants watched the sea, and in the way schoolmasters counted students. The question that was not spoken could be read in faces. How long will the money last? The answer depended on the Nile, on Roman patience, on the temper of a king, and on the willingness of citizens to keep faith with a civic project that had made Alexandria admired from Sicily to Syria. Exile did not only scatter people, it scattered habits that had been invented in the library halls. The editorial signs that marked variant lines traveled with the men who used them. The practice of writing short lives of authors at the head of a book became common outside Egypt. The catalogue as a genre of literature took root in other cities. The method survived better than the building. It is an irony with a lesson. The greatest legacy of a library may be the way it teaches readers to handle texts, not the number of shelves still standing. There is a last strand to this chapter that speaks to the character of the city even in adversity. Visitors continued to arrive. A young man from Athens brought a roll of Menander that he claimed had never been copied. A merchant from Tyre brought a Babylonian tablet that he could not read and traded it for a lease on a warehouse. A Jewish scholar newly arrived from the south came to see the Greek translation of the scriptures that he had heard about since he was a child. The library received them all. It recorded provenance where it could and set the items where they belonged. Even with thin resources, the institution kept faith with the idea that had made it famous. The world comes to a great city, and a great city keeps the world. In the years after the purge, the Mausoleum was still a school and a refuge and a symbol. It was no longer the unquestioned center of the Republic of Letters. That republic now had more capitals and more post roads. The men who had argued in the courtyards of the royal quarter now wrote from islands and hill towns and along the river Halys. They carried Alexandria with them in their hands and in their heads. They taught students to weigh a line, to compare copies, to count, to observe, to doubt, and to love clarity. In this sense, the exile that began in fear ended in influence. The disaster that posterity remembers as the first great wound to the library did not begin in a reading room. It began in the harbor. In the autumn of 48, before the Common Era, Julius Caesar entered Alexandria with a handful of legions, drawn into the quarrel between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Egypt was a client kingdom, and the debts of the Ptolemies to Rome were real. Caesar intended to arbitrate and to be paid. What he found was a court already in motion. The boy king's advisors, notably the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, had cultivated the city garrison and the populace. Cleopatra, forced from the royal quarter, waited outside the walls for a chance to return. The famous meeting of Caesar and Cleopatra belongs to theater as much as to history. The story of a queen smuggled into the palace rolled in a carpet has become a symbol for audacity and charm. What matters for the fate of the library is not the rug, but the siege that followed. Achilles marched on the royal quarter with a force that outnumbered Caesar's men many times over. The Roman took the only ground that could not be turned against him. He secured the palace district and the harbor basins, and he placed a garrison on Pharos at the lighthouse to control the entrance to the eastern port. The geometry of Alexandria, so carefully planned by Dinocrates under Alexander, became a battlefield map. Caesar's immediate problem was the Egyptian fleet at anchor and the shipyards that could produce more. With the city pressing from the landward side and the sea behind him, he chose a ruthless defense. He ordered the ships along the quays put to the torch to deny them to the enemy and to prevent a landing behind his lines. Fire is an indiscriminate ally in a city built of timber roofs and stocked warehouses. The wind took sparks and carried them into the storehouses that lined the docks and the streets that ran back toward the royal quarter. Ancient writers who loved Alexandria later walked those lanes and tried to imagine what had been lost in hours when oil burned and tar boiled on the water. The numbers that survive come to us as fragments of memory. Seneca, repeating a passage he attributed to Livy, spoke of 40,000 rolls destroyed in the fire that spread from the ships to the storehouses. Plutarch, writing of Caesar, said simply that the great library was burned. Strabo, who lived for years in Alexandria some decades later, did not give a number but remarked that certain records used by mathematicians of the earlier age were no longer available for consultation. The modern eye looks for a floor plan. It asks whether the main halls of the Mausoleum were directly touched by flame, or whether it was outlying depots and customs warehouses filled with duplicate copies and captured cargo that were consumed. The sources do not settle the matter. What they do settle is the character of the event. A fire begun as a tactic of war spread beyond intention and destroyed thousands of volumes that could not be replaced. The streets around the docks and the Heptastadion were built for commerce, not for fire breaks. Rope, sailcloth, casks, and crates filled the bays and lofts. The cubicula where rolls were stored were cool and dark, and the papyrus within took a spark as easily as dry straw. The city fought the flames with bucket lines to the basins and with demolition of adjoining walls where possible. The palace district was saved, but the price was paid in books. The men who later wrote about it used the tone reserved for earthquakes and viaduct collapses, things that happen when power meets chance. The siege itself was no less harrowing. Caesar sent parties to hold the lighthouse and the causeway to prevent the Alexandrian fleet from cutting off his communication with the open sea. Street fighting flickered along the causeway, and there is an episode in Caesar's own account in which he threw himself into the water to swim to safety when a sudden rush drove his men back from a bridge of boats. Reinforcements under Mithridates of Pergamon eventually fought down the Nile and relieved the Roman position. In the struggle, Pothinus was killed. Achilles was executed after a quarrel among the Egyptian commanders, and Cleopatra's sister Arsinoe briefly wore a diadem under the protection of the garrison that had taken her part. The battle that decided the matter was fought near the Canopic branch of the Nile, where Caesar routed the Egyptian army. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the confusion of the retreat when a boat heavy with armor turned over in the river. In the aftermath, Caesar placed Cleopatra on the throne with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV as nominal co-ruler. He remained in the city long enough to see order restored and to begin an affair that would echo in literature for 2,000 years. The damage in the harbor quarter still smoked when the palace resumed its rhythm. The library had not ceased to exist, but it had been struck. The strongest testimony for its survival lies in the life of the city that followed. Within a generation, Strabo walked the precincts and described the Mausoleum as an institution still functioning, with common dining, a priestly head, and scholarly pursuits. He did not speak as if he were writing a tombstone. There is another thread that tradition ties to this period. Mark Antony, Caesar's colleague and later Cleopatra's partner, is said to have given to Alexandria the contents of the Library of Pergamum as a royal gift. Ancient writers give the number as 200,000 volumes. The story fits Roman politics as well as Alexandrian need. Pergamum was a rival in prestige and had long cultivated its own circle of scholars. To transfer that treasure to Egypt would have been an act of love, of statesmanship, and of deliberate symbolism. Whether the gesture occurred exactly as described, and whether the number is accurate, the anecdote tells us what contemporaries believed about the intention of the rulers. They wanted the city's shelves full again. They wanted the world to know that the palace had repaired not only walls and docks, but also the reputation of Alexandria as the keeper of texts. Evidence for active scholarship during and after this recovery is firm. Didymus, the prodigy of annotation whom later generations nicknamed Bronze Guts, produced thousands of works in the last decades of the 1st century before the Common Era and the first years of the next. One cannot write commentaries at that scale without a supply of books and a community of disputation. The grammarians continued to teach. The physicians continued their rounds in lecture courts. The astronomers and geographers still found reference works to consult and records to compare. The Serapeum, the temple school that had long housed the daughter library, gained in importance as a locus of study at a remove from the palace. The intellectual economy of Alexandria recovered because it adjusted its center of gravity. The palace adapted as well. Cleopatra understood that learning was one of the currencies with which a queen could trade in a world ruled by legions. She patronized scholars and hosted banquets where poetry and mechanical entertainments showed visitors a city still worthy of its legends. The royal household paid for new copies of classics when older exemplars had perished. It granted privileges to scholars who could rebuild catalogues and train students. Cleopatra's court included men who wrote of plants, of perfumes, of cosmetics, of poisons, and of the properties of rare stones, a reminder that research in Alexandria had always mixed curiosity with utility. The economy of the city depended on merchants and ship owners, and their needs for accurate measures and reliable recipes linked laboratories to the market stalls. The memory of the fire never left the city. In the generations that followed, debates about the scale of the loss and the integrity of the collection colored every mention of the library. Scholars grieved in a way that is hard to replicate in an age of printing. A unique role is a single heartbeat. Once gone, it cannot be recovered except by chance. The librarians of the early Roman period worked under the knowledge that a shelf once emptied might never be filled again. That awareness sharpened their priorities. They invested effort in authors that defined courses of study. They trained a next generation in the habits of collation and citation that would travel beyond Egypt. They also continued to lend the city's prestige to translation projects and to the steady improvement of texts that were already widely read. The Roman presence in Alexandria increased as the century turned. After the deaths of Caesar and then of Antony and Cleopatra, Egypt became a province. The emperors understood the political value of the city and the economic value of its grain. They kept the lighthouse in repair, maintained the Heptastadion as a causeway and aqueduct, and ensured that the harbors remained deep and safe. They also took an interest in the cultural institutions that had long given Alexandria its identity. Claudius sponsored works and editions. Learned Romans held honorary places in the Mausoleum, a sign that the institution had lived on. though its character began to change from a royal academy of resident scholars to a more diffuse community of literate officials and teachers. From the standpoint of the library's story, the age of Caesar and Cleopatra thus stands as both crisis and proof. The fire was real, and the losses were grievous. The resilience was just as real. The city did not let the catastrophe harden into an ending. It treated it as a call to rebuild, using royal patronage, the energy of its scholars, and the magnetism that drew traders and visitors to a city poised between river and sea. The idea of a universal library returned to the rooms where copyists sharpened reeds, and to the courtyards where students argued about a dipple in the margin of Homer. Alexandria had been wounded, but it remembered what it was. When Octavian became Augustus and Egypt became a Roman province, Alexandria awoke to a new arithmetic of power. The city that had once been the capital of a dynasty was now the keystone of an imperial supply chain. Grain that began as silt and seed along the Nile ended as loaves in the hands of the urban poor in Rome. The annual voyage of the grain fleet was not only an economic ritual, it was a political guarantee that tied Alexandria to the fortunes of emperors. Augustus placed Egypt under a prefect drawn from the equestrian order and forbade senators to enter without permission. The message was diplomatic and severe. Alexandria mattered too much to be left to ordinary politics. It would be governed as a strategic asset, watched from the Palatine, and expected to perform. The city did perform. The lighthouse on Pharos was maintained, the Heptastadion served as causeway and aqueduct, and the twin basins of the harbors remained dredged and navigable. The canal that linked the lake to the river was cleared, and in some places recut, so that barges from the delta could deliver before winds changed. Warehouses that had once been counted merely as royal storehouses became part of the Annona, the system by which Rome fed itself. Scribes trained in Alexandrian habits kept double ledgers that recorded volume, moisture loss, and wastage, and inspectors tested the weight and alloy of coin used to pay crews. Alexandria remained a counting house, and under Rome the numbers grew larger. Culture also continued, though the tone of patronage changed. The Mautians still existed, as Strabo testifies, near the end of the 1st century before the Common Era, with a priestly head and a community of scholars who dined together and worked in the precincts. Yet the status of membership began to shift. Honorary places were given to imperial officials and to visiting dignitaries who were learned in manners more than in texts. Where the Ptolemies had paid to concentrate talent within a campus, the Roman settlement favored a more dispersed civic literacy. There were schools in the quarters near the Caesareum. There were reading rooms that belonged to guilds and to wealthy houses. The Serapeum on its hill continued as a daughter library and as a school that sheltered philosophy and mathematics in a setting both sacred and practical. A generation after Augustus, Alexandria produced one of the most influential scientific writers in history. Claudius Ptolemy worked in the city during the 2nd century. His great synthesis of astronomy drew on centuries of observation, Greek geometry, and Babylonian numerical methods to present a coherent model of the heavens. He relied on tables that earlier Alexandrian observers had preserved, and he added his own long watching of the sky. He wrote treatises on optics and geography, including a world map framed by a system of coordinates that would shape cartography for centuries. The name Ptolemy once belonged to kings, and now belonged to a scholar. The change is a measure of the city's transformation under Rome. Political sovereignty had passed. Intellectual authority remained. Hero of Alexandria also belongs to this Roman period. He gathered and extended the mechanical arts. His descriptions of siphons, valves, water organs, programmable automata, and the steam toy that later ages called the Aeolipile show a technical culture that did not vanish with the dynasty. In medicine, clinical teaching continued. Galen, a century later, wrote with respect of the anatomical traditions he encountered in Egypt. Though human dissection was not what it had been in the earliest Hellenistic years, the habit of reasoned anatomy survived in lecture halls that presented models, animal dissection, and philosophical arguments about the seat of mind and the function of the heart. The book itself began to change in the centuries of Roman rule. The papyrus roll was still the dominant form, yet the codex slowly gained favor. Early Christian communities in Egypt adopted the codex for scripture and teaching, and practical readers discovered that a stack of leaves sewn at one side could be opened at a place known in an instant and could hold marginalia with more ease. Parchment did not supplant papyrus in Alexandria in these early centuries, but mixed libraries appeared. Scribes and bookbinders adapted. They learned new sewing structures and gluing techniques. They cut wood or ivory for covers and laid on leather with decorative tooling. Alexandria kept its old workshops and learned new ones. The emperors had not forgotten the city as a symbol. Claudius made additions and repairs, and imperial names appeared on benefactions that touched public buildings and scholarly spaces alike. Members of noble Roman families held offices in the city and sometimes received the title associated with the Mausian, a sign that the institution remained a point of honor. This honor could turn tragic when politics and satire crossed. In the year 38 of the Common Era, ethnic violence erupted. Tensions between segments of the Greek citizenry and the large and ancient Jewish community burst into riots. Houses were looted, synagogues were attacked, and the Roman prefect Flaccus mishandled the crisis so badly that he was later arrested and executed. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher steeped in Greek thought, wrote passionate accounts of these days. His testimony shows a city where learning and commerce thrived alongside resentments that could be stirred by demagogues and by the careless use of authority. Wider shocks came with the Kitos War during the reign of Trajan, when unrest among Jewish communities across the eastern Mediterranean flared into violence. In Alexandria, as in Cyprus and Cyrenaica, the fighting was savage. The city suffered destruction that forced rebuilding of quarters and civic amenities. A few generations later, the Emperor Caracalla visited and, angered by mocking verses and public insult, ordered a massacre of the city's young men and the confiscation of properties. He also raised taxes and reduced local privileges. These episodes mattered for the story of the library because cultural institutions do not float above their cities. When neighborhoods burn, the people who care for shelves and catalogs scatter. When treasuries are squeezed, stipends become discretionary. When fear governs, the loudest voice is not the one asking after a corrupt line in a poem. The character of the scholarly class also changed. In the Ptolemaic age, the head librarian had been the visible tip of a pyramid of resident scholars. Under Rome, the honor remained, but the essential work was increasingly done by men who did not necessarily live or dine within the Mausian. Teachers held private schools. Officials with literary training composed administrative manuals. Wealthy families maintained house libraries and sponsored the copying of texts for friends and for the civic good. The idea of a single central cabinet that contained everything never matched reality. But under Rome, the reality moved further toward a network of collections and away from a single royal core. Alexandria also sat at a crossroads of faith in these centuries, and that fact shaped the fate of books. The Serapeum continued to dominate the southwestern hill as an architectural marvel and as a school where the last generation of pagan philosophers in the city would later gather. The cult of Serapis had long symbolized a policy of cultural fusion. In the Roman centuries, the temple precinct also signaled continuity with an older civic identity, while the streets below saw the rise of Christian congregations and bishops with growing influence. Christian teachers read Homer and Plato and also argued that a new canon was being formed that would need scribes and binders and classrooms of its own. The city that once prided itself on translation between Hebrew and Greek, watched as scripture in codex form moved through its quarters with a seriousness that matched anything in the Mausion. The physical plant of learning changed as well. Earthquakes are sparse in our sources for these centuries, but subsidence, salt air, and neglect can undo masonry. Porticos need pillars replaced. Roofs need tiles renewed. Drains clog. Rats find a way. The Roman administration funded repairs that served commerce first and prestige second. An extension to a library could be built in one reign and stripped for building stone in another when funds ran short. At the same time, private donors filled gaps. Names of local benefactors appear in inscriptions tied to lecture halls and porticos. A wealthy shipper endowed a reading room close to the docks. A guild of papyrus makers paid to roof a walkway. The civic religion of benefaction helped keep spaces usable. Catalogues continued to be copied and revised, yet the famous Pinaques of Callimachus were already a memory rather than a living instrument. New lists arose for particular collections in the Caesareum or the Claudianum. The daughter library at the Serapeum maintained its own order. Regional scholars who visited Alexandria kept working bibliographies for their subjects and compared lists when they met. The method survived, even as the central map blurred. It is one of the strengths of the Alexandrian invention that it could function as a practice dispersed across rooms and cities. Fiscal policy left fingerprints on the scholarly life. In stable years, the prefect's office paid for the maintenance of institutions, sometimes with help from Rome. In crisis years, taxes rose, coin was clipped, and privileges were suspended. The 3rd century brought the long tremors that historians call the crisis of the empire. Rival emperors, invasions across frontiers, plague, and inflation pressed every province. In Egypt, the effects were felt in the purchase price of lamp oil for reading rooms and cedar oil for shelves, in the number of copyists the city could employ, and in the frequency with which the guards of the prefect would escort grain to the quays and leave the precincts unattended. There is nothing dramatic about a water clock that cannot be repaired because the bronze smith has gone to work on spearheads, but such small losses explain how a famous campus can begin to go quiet. Personalities who held titles associated with the Mausion during the Roman period testify to its altered character. Tiberius Claudius Balbillus, a learned astrologer and an imperial courtier, is named in inscriptions with honors linked to Alexandria's institutions. He was no Zenodotus or Aristarchus. He was a gentleman of affairs, whose presence signaled favor between court and city. Honorary membership kept the name alive, but changed the expectations of the office. The best scholars still worked in Alexandria, yet the headship no longer guaranteed that the person in charge would be the finest editor in the Mediterranean. Amid all this, learning did not die. Instruction continued in grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and medicine. Students still memorized Homer and learned to parse the parts of speech from manuals that owed much to Alexandrian predecessors. Astronomers continued to take observations. Geographers copied routes and sailing directions. Natural philosophers wrote on tides and winds and on the refraction of light near the horizon. The city remained a magnet for travelers who wished to see the lighthouse and the long straight reach of the Canopic Way, and many of them also wished to walk the precincts where scholars read under figs and planes. A visitor in the 2nd century would have found a learned city, with fewer stipends and less central authority than in the age of the first Ptolemies, but still confident in its craft. 2 long shadows lengthened as the 3rd century advanced. One was military. The empire's borders shuddered. and the attention of emperors turned repeatedly to legions and rebellions. The other was religious. Christian communities grew in number and influence. Their bishops spoke with increasing confidence, and the implicit contract that had long balanced temple, court, and school began to fray. These shadows would meet in the next act, when battles fought for imperial power and struggles fought to define the religious soul of the city brought fire into quarters that had once seemed immortal. The Roman centuries thus laid out the path to the final crisis. They proved that Alexandria could adapt to a new political order, sustain a tradition of scholarship without a royal court, and continue to add to the sciences and letters. They also exposed the fragility of institutions that rely on steady money, civic peace, and educated pride. The Mausion grew more honorary. The library grew more distributed. The Serapeum grew more central as a place of teaching. The city continued to read, to argue, and to write, but the scaffolding that had held everything together creaked in the wind. The end did not fall in a single night. It arrived in waves that crossed generations, each one eating at the edges of a civic memory until only fragments remained. The first great shock came with the Palmyrene War. In the year we now call 270, the Emperor Aurelian drove against Queen Zenobia, whose armies had taken Egypt and with it the grain lifeline of Rome. The fight for Alexandria was brutal. Ancient writers say that Aurelian retook quarter after quarter, and that the Bruchion, the royal district facing the harbors where the Mausion and the old palace libraries had stood, was devastated. Fire followed steel. If any halls of the original royal library still functioned, they were caught in that storm. The vocabulary of later chroniclers is spare and final. The quarter was laid waste. A generation later, Alexandria met another hammer. In 297, during the revolt of Lucius Domitius Domitianus, Diocletian besieged the city. He built causeways and towers, cut the canals, and forced surrender after months of hunger. The emperor entered in triumph and ordered punishments that the sources call severe. Stone was pulled from public walls to repair forts. The city endured the cost paid by many who lose a civil war. These campaigns rarely list libraries among their victims, yet the pattern is clear. When the quarter that housed the royal collections is repeatedly burned and pulled down, cupboards of papyrus do not survive. Scholarship did not die with those walls. It shifted its center to the southwest hill where the Serapeum stood. The Temple of Serapis had been a symbol of the city since Ptolemy I blended Greek and Egyptian sensibilities into a single cult. The precinct had classrooms, porticos, and a daughter library that had long served as a second hive of study. In the later 3rd and 4th centuries, it became the leading home of secular teaching in Alexandria. Philosophers of the Neoplatonic line lectured there. Mathematicians trained pupils with models and diagrams. The precinct held a reputation for calm that stood in contrast to the troubles of the lower city. It could not stand apart from the new religious climate that grew under the emperors who favored Christianity. By the reign of Theodosius I, Christian bishops in Alexandria spoke with great authority, and imperial edicts ordered the closing of pagan temples. In 391, the Patriarch Theophilus led a movement to clear the city of its old cults. The Serapeum became the stage on which the change of age was acted. Crowds entered the precinct, toppled the great statue of the god, and brought down roofs and walls with ropes and levers. Eyewitnesses tell the same story in different voices. They describe the smashing of statues, the looting of treasure, and the leveling of a sanctuary that had been the pride of the city. If the daughter library still held rolls in its cedar cupboards, they had no patron left who could defend them. The precinct was cleared to its foundations. The hill no longer smelled of incense and oil. It smelled of dust. The next years fixed the direction of Alexandria. Christian schools grew in the lower city. Bishops adjudicated disputes and sponsored charities. The language of scholarship took on the color of theology. Yet there were still teachers who carried forward the exact habits of the old tradition. The most famous among them was Hypatia, a mathematician and philosopher who taught in the early 5th century. Her father, Theon, edited mathematical texts and commented on Ptolemy. She lectured on geometry, astronomy, and philosophy to young men of standing, pagan and Christian alike. Her murder in 415 by a mob that claimed to act in the name of piety shocked the empire. It also served as an epilogue for the public life of classical learning in Alexandria. The event was political, born of city factions and the struggle between a bishop and a prefect, but its echo in memory attached to the story of the books. People said that a way of thinking had been slain in the street with her. The centuries that followed carried new rulers and new stories. Arab armies entered Egypt in the 7th century and made Fustat their capital. A legend later claimed that the conquerors found an ancient library and fueled bathhouse furnaces with its rolls for months. No contemporary source records such a deed, and the tale appears many centuries after the fact. By then, the royal quarter had been erased, and the Serapeum had been empty for 200 years. What survived of the old collections had long since traveled in copies to other cities and other tongues. The last blows to the great library therefore belonged to Roman and late Roman time, to Aurelian in war, to Diocletian in siege, and to Theophilus in a purge carried out under imperial law. We should pause and see what was lost and what was saved. Buildings fell and shelves burned. Catalogues were broken into pieces and repurposed as scrap. Yet the method of Alexandria had already taken root elsewhere. Editors in Pergamum and Rhodes used its signs. Scribes in Antioch and in Byzantine scriptoria used its habits. Translators in Syria and in the academies of the early Islamic world handled Greek science that had once been collated in Alexandria. The city taught the Mediterranean how to keep texts alive by multiplication and by commentary. That lesson survived even the ruin of the rooms where it was learned. When a visitor in the 5th century climbed the hill where the Serapeum had stood, he saw a solitary column that we still call by the name of Pompey, though it belongs to a later emperor. Wind moved across the foundations, and the view stretched to the sea. The lighthouse still burned at night, ships still crossed the basins, and the heptastadion still carried traffic between city and island. But the institutional heart that had once gathered scholars to dine and to dispute was gone. The life of the mind had not ended. It had changed its addresses. Long after porticos cracked and shelves collapsed, the library grew larger in memory than in stone. The city's learned heart, once measured by catalogue leaves and the hum of copyists, became a parable that different ages told to explain their fears and their hopes about knowledge. What burned was not only papyrus. A story burned its way into the common inheritance of the Mediterranean and then far beyond it. Each generation chose a culprit who suited its lessons. Roman moralists preferred to see a single tragic spark in Julius Caesar's harbor fires. They imagined a commander who won a siege, and by accident unstitched civilization's archive. Christian chroniclers of late antiquity, writing in a time when temples fell and new scriptures rose, placed the last act at the Serapeum when a crowd obeyed imperial edicts and cleared the hill to its foundations. Centuries later, writers in Arabic and Syriac repeated a tale in which the conquerors of Egypt found a hoard of books and asked the caliph whether to spare them. In this story, the answer is a severe epigram. If the books agree with scripture, they are unnecessary. If they do not, they are harmful. The bathhouse furnaces then glow for months on the fuel of a dead age. The details arrive late and vary with the teller. The silence of 7th century observers speaks as loudly as the rhetoric of the 13th. Modern historians weigh provenance and date, and find that the legend belongs to a season of polemic rather than to the first decades after the conquest. Yet it persists because it answers a human appetite. Disaster feels complete when a single decision can be blamed. Other legends are kinder. Mark Antony famously gives to Cleopatra the Library of Pergamum. 200,000 rolls change hands as a wedding gift, and the river of words flows back to the Nile to refill what the harbor blaze had taken. The gesture pleases because it imagines a court that repairs with love what war has damaged. It also flatters Alexandria with a rival's tribute. Whether the numbers are exact or the transaction literal, the story reveals what contemporaries believed about the stakes. The city that held the books held the future. There are legends inside the walls as well. The Pinakes of Callimachus, that ambitious map of literature, becomes in later retellings a lost key that would have led any reader straight to treasure. One imagines a set of tablets that listed every play of Aeschylus, every book by Herodotus, every treatise by the mathematicians, with notes on authenticity, first lines, and provenance. A scholar who has ever searched a shelf for a title that must be there will understand why the Pinakes fascinate. Their loss feels like the theft of a compass. Fragments of the project survive in citations and summaries, enough to prove its scope and method, not enough to replace it. The city also gathered myths about secret rooms and hidden vaults. Visitors in late antiquity described underground passages in the royal quarter and beneath the Serapeum, where priests and librarians were said to have stored precious works against times of trouble. Archaeology in the modern city is hard. Water tables, later foundations, and constant habitation keep the ground from speaking in long sentences. There is enough evidence of magazines and service corridors to encourage a story that rolls can still emerge from a wall, where a mason tucked them when the noise of soldiers grew close. Discoveries elsewhere in Egypt fan this hope. The Oxyrhynchus dumps, dry and hospitable to papyrus, have yielded poems of Sappho and plays of Menander thought, lost for good. The Nag Hammadi codices appeared from jars in a farmer's field and gave the world a library of early Christian texts no catalogue had promised. If the desert can lift a veil for a village 200 miles from Alexandria, why not for a street along the Canopic Way? The question keeps legends alive, even as careful minds insist on evidence. The Lost Library also gathered a roll call of vanished works that now feel like characters in a cast. Lists begin with the completed plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, with histories by Theopompus and Hecataeus, with treatises of the atomists, with the many books of the philosopher Chrysippus, with maps and coastal guides that sailors once used to run the Levant by night. The image that fixes itself in the popular mind shows a single great blaze and a shelf of unique masterpieces curling to ash. The reality, if we honor the sources and the timelines, is a slower erosion across centuries. Ptolemaic acquisitions were real and often aggressive. Roman repair and Roman neglect alternated with the politics of the day. Aurelian's soldiers tore down the Bruchon when they reconquered a city in revolt. Diocletian finished what ruin had begun when he starved Alexandria into submission and paid for walls with stone taken from what had been royal. The Serapeum stood as a school and a daughter library until the age of Theodosius, when the precinct met the hammer of a new religious policy. There is no final inventory to check against a fire report. There is a history of attrition that makes a single villain less convincing than a long wind. Against this long wind stand, other narratives that treat the library as a seed rather than as a victim. The practice of Alexandria traveled. Grammar, cataloging, copying at scale, and the use of critical signs moved with exiles and with students to Pergamum, Rhodes, Antioch, and Rome. Greek learning flowed into Syriac and then into Arabic in the translation movement of the early Abbasid age. Names associated with Baghdad's House of Wisdom appear as guides in this relay. Hunayn ibn Ishaq translated Galen and Hippocrates. Thabit ibn Qurra edited and improved texts in mathematics and astronomy, and he wrote in ways that a reader trained on Euclid would recognize. Ptolemy's star tables, the Almagest in a later title, stood at the center of a new science that reached from river to river. Scholars in Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba read books that had once passed under the eyes of Alexandrian librarians. When the Renaissance in Latin Europe searched for antiquity's voice, it often did so through Arabic and Greek copies made in these centuries. The child of a lost library taught distant schools how to care for words. The city's Jewish story supplies another thread that scholars and storytellers both prize. The Septuagint, translated in Alexandria, made the Hebrew scriptures speak the language of merchants and philosophers. Later generations embroidered the scene into a miracle. 70 or 72 translators worked in separate rooms and produced identical renderings. The legend speaks to anxieties about fidelity and to faith in providence. The outcome speaks to the character of the city. Translation in Alexandria was a public work. It made communities intelligible to one another and altered the course of religion and literature. The presence of that Greek Bible in the ancient collection gave later readers a reason to imagine that Alexandria held other missing books that could reconcile traditions if only they were found again. Travelers who wrote about Alexandria in late centuries added romance to record. They described the column on the Serapeum Hill that we now call Pompey's Pillar, a survivor that lifts the eye and invites listeners to imagine halls around it. They told of curious machines in private houses that the owners said were made according to designs from the old mechanical handbooks. They praised teachers who called themselves Platonists and who wore plain cloaks in a city that had once dressed its scholars in priestly titles. In these portraits, the library becomes a mood as much as a place. It is a way of looking at a city that measures its greatness by the number of voices it can host. Finally, the legend turns from culprits and treasures to a moral. It asks what duties belong to a state and to a city when they inherit learning. The story of Alexandria makes a case that is not subtle. Patronage matters. Stipends and roofs matter. Tolerance matters. Catalogues and bibliographers matter as much as poets and inventors. A copyist at a well-lit table can be a hero in the long war against forgetting. Myths tend to sharpen this lesson by imagining a moment when a decision erased a world. History softens it by showing a chain of choices, some generous and some careless, that together produce the same result. The legend draws tears with a vision of flames leaping across pigeonholes. The historian wins patience by pointing to a ledger, a tax decree, a siege plan, a sermon, a ship cargo, and a workshop where cedar oil ran low. The library lives in both registers because both are true in their ways. The heart needs images, the mind needs causes. In the end, the most persuasive legend about the library is that it never quite leaves us. It is there when a city funds a public school. It is there when a small archive posts its catalogue online and a reader on another continent finds a lost cousin to a text she loves. It is there when a teacher explains to a child that a good note in the margin is a gift to a future reader. Alexandria became a cautionary tale about loss and a working plan for survival. That double life is why we still use its name as a measure for our ambitions. The ruins of Alexandria are silent, but its method kept speaking. What began as royal patronage in a port between lake and sea became a template for how civilizations rescue their own memory. The city taught later ages that knowledge is a public work, that it needs money, space, and rules, and that the best defense against loss is multiplication. The first heirs stood closer than legend sometimes allows. Long after the royal quarter fell, The Byzantine world maintained workshops where Greek texts were copied, glossed, and carefully compared. Monks in Constantinople carried forward habits that any Alexandrian librarian would have recognized. Lists of first lines for identification, notes on provenance, a suspicion of smooth stories, and a preference for named sources. Grammar manuals descended from Dionysius Thrax shaped the schooling of Greek-speaking boys from Antioch to Trebizond. The Imperial Library of Constantinople did not pretend to be universal, but its stewards organized and preserved a collection that contained the bones of ancient science, medicine, and literature. When fires and sackings came to the Bosporus, 1,000 quiet acts of copying had already prepared survivors elsewhere. Farther to the east, the translation movement of the early Abbasid age made a second Alexandria along the Tigris. At the court in Baghdad, scholars gathered under caliphs who believed that prestige and policy were both served by a city of books. They translated medicine from Greek into Syriac and from Syriac into Arabic. They brought mathematical texts across languages and improved them in the act of translation. Hunayn ibn Ishaq built a team that compared multiple exemplars of Galen, resolved contradictions, and produced Arabic versions that were both faithful and clear. Thabit ibn Qurra and his school edited number theory and astronomy and pushed them forward. The Almagest entered Arabic as a working manual for astronomers who built observatories from Damascus to Samarkand. Geography gained new tables and a new earth. The habit of the catalogue traveled too. Bibliographers in Baghdad and later in Cairo compiled lists of authors and titles by subject and by alphabet, often with judgments about authenticity that echo Callimachus. What had been royal policy on the Nile matured into a civic craft by the Tigris. To the west, monastic Europe kept a different kind of faith with the Alexandrian idea. In scriptoria from Ireland to Italy, copyists wrote on parchment through winters, long enough to test any vocation. The book changed shape. The codex replaced the roll. Margins became a space where readers argued with texts and with one another across centuries. The decorative arts of the Carolingian age and the discipline of the scholastic houses met in the labor of making a page that could be read by candlelight and by a student 2 towns away before sunrise. When the first great universities formed in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, they carried forward another Alexandrian belief. A city grows strong by making rooms where questions can be asked in public. The chain of survival bent again in Italy, where merchants and humanists in the 14th and 15th centuries searched monastic libraries and civic cupboards for ancient works that had fallen from regular use. Petrarch and his friends taught Europe to treat a manuscript as a ship returned from a voyage rather than as a relic to be displayed and forgotten. A copy made in a Camaldolese house could be the spark for a republic of letters that reached from Florence to Bruges. When the press came, first to Mainz and then to Venice and Basel, the craft of comparison and correction had a new tool. Printers hired scholars who collated multiple exemplars and annotated choices in the margins. The old signs of the Alexandrian editors had new relatives in the manicules and pointing hands of the early printed page. Catalogues moved from tablets and lists to printed inventories and bookseller catalogues that allowed scholars to request a title from another city and expect it to arrive. By then, the intellectual DNA of Alexandria had become so ordinary that it could vanish into the background of public life. City councils voted to fund schools. Donors built libraries and put their names in stone above doors. Librarians wrote rules for borrowing, for quiet, for hours, for the care of bindings, for the treatment of margins as a shared space rather than as a private notebook. A new science of bibliography grew, first as a learned passion and then as a profession. National libraries defined legal deposit so that a country could have a memory that did not depend on chance. The classification systems of the modern age gave numbers and subjects to shelves in a way that Callimachus would have recognized as kin. Card catalogues, and then digital catalogues, extended the Pinakes into forms that are faster but not different in spirit. The sciences carried forward the most exacting portion of the Alexandrian legacy. Astronomers who observed supernovae in China and Denmark wrote their notes into a tradition that had begun when Eratosthenes placed a gnomon in sunlight and when Hipparchus compared lists of stars. Physicians who prepared anatomical theaters and later anatomy atlases did so within a culture that accepts the authority of the seen. Mathematicians proved theorems with a mental voice trained by Euclid. Geographers laid out maps with grids and coordinates that became the common language of navigation and then of satellites. Everywhere a footnote appears, and everywhere a scholar refuses to accept a claim without a source, Alexandria nods. There is also the legacy that cannot be shelved. The library became a symbol that policymakers and ordinary citizens could understand without reading a line of Greek. It stands for the idea that the health of a city includes its books and its schools. It is invoked when a government funds a new public library and when a class of third graders walks beneath a ceiling painted with the names of authors they have not yet read. It whispers in the ear of a cataloguer who stays late to check a date and in the ear of a teacher who tells a student that a careful citation is a civic act. It stands, finally, for humility. The oldest catalogue of catalogues burned. The oldest school of schools closed its doors. We have what we have because copyists counted lines, and because donors paid for roofs, and because readers in every age believed that a page is a promise. In Alexandria itself, the emblem returned to stone. On the shore east of the old harbor, a modern building opened its doors with a name that remembers. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina rose from a circle set into the ground like a rising sun, its walls carved with scripts from many languages, its reading room wide as a plaza. It holds books and galleries and classrooms, but more important than its holdings is its claim. A modern city declared itself willing to carry an old task: to gather, to teach, to lend, to invite, to digitize so that floods and fires cannot take everything at once, to host scholars and school children at the same tables, to act as a bridge between past and present, between Egyptian heritage and a global public. The building is not the ancient library. It is something more useful to us than a ghost. It is a reminder that the right answer to loss is work. The last measure of an enduring legacy is what ordinary people do with it. A mother in Nairobi uses a free digital catalogue to help her child pronounce the names of Greek gods. A student in Krakow reads a Syriac translation of Aristotle on a phone while waiting for a tram. A curator in Alexandria uploads high-resolution images of a papyrus so that a graduate student in Buenos Aires can enlarge a torn corner and propose a better reading. A city librarian in Louisville argues before a council that Sunday hours are part of public safety and cites the reading habits of teenagers as evidence. In each act, there is an echo from a hall where scholars once ate together under fig trees and argued about a line in Homer. Alexandria taught the world that a library is not a trophy. It is a system. It is a promise made by the living to the unborn that the record will be kept as best as it can be, and that errors will be corrected in public. That promise worked in a royal quarter lit by oil, in monastic rooms lit by winter sun, in a caliphal palace lit by lamps of glass, in a Venetian press lit by type metal, and now in screens lit by diodes. The materials change. The pledge remains the same. Begin in the sand and under the surf. That is where the city keeps speaking. The library's story survives not only in the prose of ancient historians, but also in a scatter of clues laid down by workmen, priests, teachers, and sailors who never expected to be read. Shards of pottery with quick accounts scratched in ink. Tax receipts folded like birds and tied with string. A lost lecture hall whose steps still hold the imprint of 1,000 sandals. The afterlife of Alexandria is an investigation, and it is conducted with notebooks, tapes, cameras, and the patience to let a small fact change a large story. On the hill we call the Serapeum, the 19th century dug out colossal fragments and a forest of broken bases. This is where a temple once spread its courts, and where a daughter library held cedar-lined cupboards of books. A single granite column rises there still, a survivor crowned in late Roman honor that later ages misnamed for Pompey. Around its base, excavators found pavements worn smooth and service corridors where porters once shouldered crates. Far below the hill, under today's apartments, archaeologists traced galleries and stairwells that suggest storerooms and classrooms. Pieces of inscribed lintels turned up in garden walls where the stone had been reused. Each fragment is a sentence in a document that wind and time tried to erase. Across the modern city, at Com el Dika, a tidy miracle appeared in the soil. Workmen clearing for a housing project uncovered rows of stepped auditoria, small covered classrooms made of brick and dressed with limestone, dating to the Roman and late Roman centuries. Dozens of teaching rooms stood side by side, like a campus frozen mid-term. The benches and apses tell a simple truth that shadows every argument about the library. When the royal quarter faltered, learning did not disappear. It moved to places like these and taught grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and mathematics to students who would keep the civic machine turning. The rooms echo with the voice of a teacher reading Homer and with the scratch of a stylus on wax. Walk toward the water, and the investigation descends. Divers in the eastern harbor map columns and architectural blocks by feel and by light that fades to green. Storms and the slow settling of the heptastadion have changed the coastline since the age of the Ptolemies. The sea covers parts of the royal quarter and the island of Antiohodos, where Cleopatra kept a palace. Underwater archaeology has traced quay walls, massive foundations, and fragments of statuary that likely stood within or near the precincts where scholars once dined. This is not the library itself. It is the city that made a library possible. A harbor with disciplined stonework and a causeway that held the tides in check were as important to the Mausian as any catalogue. Beyond Alexandria, the desert does its own work of preservation. At Oxyrhynchus in Middle Egypt, the dry dumps of an ordinary town have yielded thousands of papyri. Out of broken baskets and long-dead courtyards have come poems of Sappho, new scenes from Menander, fragments of lost historians, and school exercises with the teacher's corrections still visible in a firm hand. These were not library copies. They are evidence that the library's habit of multiplication reached deep into civic life. A book copied for a local reader might be discarded and buried, only to be read again 2,000 years later in a laboratory with good light. The desert is an accidental archivist. It has given us a counter-argument to the myth of catastrophe. When a central shelf vanished, other shelves elsewhere kept the words alive. Another branch of the hunt looks not for shelves, but for methods. How do we know that Callimachus mapped literature? Because later authors cite the Pinakes and treat them as a standard. How do we know a fire took the bookstores by the docks in the days of Caesar? Because an ancient writer cites Livy on the loss of tens of thousands of rolls, and because later witnesses like Plutarch and Orosius draw that smoke across their own pages. How do we know that the Serapeum fell beneath a crowd led by a bishop obeying an imperial edict? Because Christian and non-Christian voices alike describe the same event in the same year with different music and the same notes. History withholds the final floor plan and the final ledger, but it supplies converging lines of testimony. The craft is to weigh them in public. The hunt is also linguistic. Greek leads the way, but the relay continues in Syriac and Arabic and Latin. Greek science and letters entered Syriac monasteries along trade routes that connected Egypt with Mesopotamia. From there, translators in Baghdad turned medical and mathematical books into clear Arabic that invited improvement. A physician in the House of Wisdom would compare multiple Greek exemplars with a Syriac version and produce an Arabic text that future doctors could trust. This was not nostalgia for a fallen city. It was the continuation of an Alexandrian conviction that accuracy is a civic virtue. When Latin Europe went looking for Aristotle and Galen in the 12th century, it often did so by reading Arabic and translating again. The chain of custody is the legacy. Modern tools press further. A charred roll from Herculaneum, buried by a volcano far from Egypt, can now be read without unrolling by using subtle differences in density that mark out letters hidden in the carbonized layers. Multispectral imaging pulls faded ink back into view on Egyptian papyri that human eyes had given up. Digital databases gather papyrus fragments and cross-link them by hand, by script, and by content so that scholars in different cities can reunite a torn document across continents. Catalogues that began on wax tablets and wooden boards now live in servers. A student can search for every witness to a passage in Herodotus with a keystroke and then ask to see the photograph of the oldest copy. The oldest problem in Alexandria was how to find the right roll. The newest answer is to let a catalogue speak faster. The city's myth invites imagination as well as proof, and a responsible account can make room for both. If we walk through the royal quarter in the mind, we can trace the morning of a day just before the purge under a late Ptolemy. The librarians check the harbour list and see that a merchantman from Rhodes has declared 3 sacks of books taken as surety on a debt. The sacks are carried to a copy room. The lector clears his throat, and the hands begin to move. Down the hall, a class has met to hear a physician talk about the pulse and its kinds. In another court, a mathematician draws a right triangle in sand and speaks about ratios. At noon, a courier arrives from Cyrene with a letter from Eratosthenes for a student of a student, copied by a friend, folded and sealed with wax, bearing questions about the length of the Nile in flood years. A prince of the court passes by with a retinue, and the scholars stand, even the proudest of them, because the house still depends on royal money. The afternoon is given to comparison and to notes. The evening brings a recital in the refectory, where a visiting poet reads a few lines and answers questions from a grammarian who has been waiting to ask them for 3 years. Nothing in this imagined day contradicts what the evidence insists upon. The speculative scene gives a body to the dry bones of receipts and decrees. There are still puzzles to solve. Where exactly were the main halls of the early library within the Bruchion? How much of the collection had already been dispersed to other sites in the city by the time of Aurelian? What did the catalogue entries for Egyptian ritual texts look like when Greek librarians filed them beside Homer? Were there dedicated rooms for copies in Egyptian script? And did priests from the countryside sit at those tables? What proportion of the roll count often cited in ancient sources represented unique works rather than duplicates and revised editions? Every answer demands humility. Alexandria was not a single building and not a single moment. It was a system stretched across streets and centuries. The moral dimension of the hunt belongs to the present. The modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina stands near the old harbour as a statement that cities can choose memory as policy. Its reading room takes in daylight like an amphitheatre. Its walls wear scripts from many languages like a carved promise. It funds preservation and digitization not as luxuries, but as the minimum duty of a custodial city. The point is not to recreate an ancient glory. The point is to continue the work that made the ancient city useful to strangers. A librarian in Alexandria today makes the same vow that a librarian made under Philadelphus: to keep the record, to make it findable, to share it with anyone who asks in good faith. There is romance in this, and there is also the arithmetic of survival. Papyrus rots, shelves warp, storms take roofs. Politics can turn the learned into targets or bystanders. The only reliable defense is multiplication and dispersal, anchored by public catalogues and public funding. Alexandria learned this early when it sent copies abroad. The world learned it again through monastic scriptoria, caliphal translation houses, early presses, and now distributed digital archives. The more copies in more places, the less likely it is that any army or any accident can silence a voice. In the end, the library's last chapter is not a lament. It is a field manual. It tells every city that wishes to be more than a market to build rooms where the young can learn to read with care. It tells every government that schools, libraries, and archives are not ornaments. They are infrastructure as vital as roads and clean water. It tells every reader that a neat note in the margin is not a private habit, but a public gift. It tells every scholar that a clear citation is a form of gratitude. It tells every citizen that the price of memory is small compared with the cost of forgetting.